Hello and welcome to In Conversation with WLV Doctoral College. I'm Deborah Curitan and I work in research development at the university.
And I'm Dr. Ben Halligan, I'm Director of the Doctoral College.
Today's vlog we're going to talk about the methodology chapter because we've been doing a series of vlogs that have looked at various chapters of the doctorate, so now we're looking at the methodology. So Ben, one of the first points we wanted to discuss was the difference between methodology and method. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that the methodology chapter is really saying what you're going to do and why you're doing that and how you're doing that. So often it will be beyond the literature review, so beyond the kind of address of the area, a scoping of the material and the ideas in the area, perhaps identifying good and bad practices within the area that you want to maybe follow or expand the good, you want to avoid the bad, and identifying a gap in knowledge. So in a way, all of this kind of background stuff has been done, which clears the way for the methodology and the method and the methodology itself. So what is the difference between these two? For me, I think often when you talk about the methodology, you might talk in more general terms. You might say using the experimental paradigm developed by this person and that person, or using a series of questionnaires and the techniques are identified as this or that. I will then seek to investigate something or other. And the method, I suppose, is a bit more pragmatic. It's actually how you're going to do it. So in the case of the experimental paradigm, you might say, well, we're going to be combining these chemicals in this environment, and we're going to do this, 60 times, and there'll be a reason why it's 60 and not 50 and not 70.
Yeah.
We'll stop at this point and review the results and see if it's yielding the data we need and that kind of thing. So that's actually pragmatically what you're then going to go and do. Mm-hmm. Or in my questionnaires analogy would perhaps be we're going to, therefore we've decided to interview 100 people. We'll do it in their places of work, not in a university environment. The interviews will be structured in this way. We will seek to talk to people in this particular region and this particular region, but not that particular region. So it's the kind of menu of what's to come. And obviously in that we might need some engagement with the ethical clearance for those elements of experimentation and research.
So what you're saying is that the methodology is about the macro level arguments that underpin the research and the way that you are doing the research, and the method is the micro level stuff, which is more about the recipe of how you've done the research, so others are able to replicate the work that you're doing.
Yes, 100%. I mean, can I give you maybe a cooking analogy?
Yeah.
So if you decided it's Sunday, philosophically we have a Sunday roast, or nut loaf in the case of vegetarians like ourselves. So we have the argument that because it's a Sunday, you have a Sunday roast in the UK. So that would be the methodology in a way. But the method would be, so we need to buy these potatoes and these carrots, and we need to get these ingredients in, and we're going to start cooking this at this point and cooking that at another point. Maybe that's a clearer analogy of the difference between these two things. So
when we start talking about methodologies, we're talking about some of the theoretical aspects of the approaches that we're taking, but there's also philosophical arguments that would come into the methodology, and some of those are around words that scare people: ontology, epistemology, axiology, those sort of things.
Positionality.
It's positionality.
Intersectionality.
Yes.
Good God.
So that's quite complex, and often when we're talking to students in some of the sessions that we do with as part of the skills development program, people kind of pale a little bit when you start talking about ontology and epistemology. But it is important to know those terms and what they mean, because really what you're doing with a doctorate is creating knowledge. So you need to be aware of your beliefs about how knowledge is created, and your role within that creation of knowledge. So that's where ontology and epistemology come into it. Now, I've had people say to me, well, I do scientific research, so I don't talk about ontology and epistemology, and you don't. But you do need to know what those philosophical underpinnings of the research approach that you're using are, because you are creating knowledge. People who are doing more qualitative or mixed methods pieces of work do tend to talk about ontology and epistemology within their thesis, and they will have a section in their thesis where they address their philosophical positions. And the reason that they do that is to show that they know that the philosophical underpinnings of the methodological approach that they are using align with their philosophical beliefs about the way that knowledge is created. So when examiners are examining pieces of work like that, they are looking for those clear links. In the same way as they look to see whether the methodology and the method allow the student to answer the research questions that they've set. So there are links between each of these sections. So there are other types of philosophies that you discussed. You talked about positionality. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think this is something fairly new in terms of PhD writing and thinking. And I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, people weren't doing this whatsoever. And what I understand by positionality is to address your particular position in relation to, say, what you're looking at, or the materials you're examining, or the people you're interviewing. So to acknowledge that data may change because of the power relations between you and, say, the people you're interviewing. So, to give you an example, I mean, suppose you're looking at teenage girls and pregnancy in the UK or something like that. If you were going to interview a number of teenage girls that have fallen into that category or are in that category, you might think about how you go about interviewing them in terms of, if you're there with a clipboard, maybe a sort of white coat, you're doing it in a university environment, they might see you as a figure of authority, maybe more in touch with their parents than with them. They may therefore give you a certain set of answers that are the kind of official set of answers and not the real set of answers. If you perhaps change all that and go into their environment and maybe dress in a different way, or maybe other techniques to sort of try and level that power relationship, they may be a lot more open, honest, in terms of what they're saying. So I'm not saying that either of those are the sort of right method, but I think there has to be an awareness of the position of the researcher in relation to the material. Sometimes this is quite brief, it's just a paragraph. Sometimes it's quite substantial, depending on the nature of the research at hand.
So that's going back to what I was saying earlier about your role within the research.
Yeah.
I think there are other types of positionality you need to think about as well. So in my field of research and educational research, as a practitioner researcher, you need to think about your role as an insider researcher and whether you're actually a practitioner yourself who's researching other practitioners and what influence that has and what are the ethical implications of that in terms of your research as well, in terms of your protection of others, in terms of your protection of your organisation.
There's an awful lot in there, isn't there? But that would also fit well into a methodology, I think. I think in terms of, you're talking about how it kind of loops back to other bits and pieces, expands the key questions and so forth. This is why in Vivas the examiners always go for the methodology. They'll ask a few pleasant questions, maybe a few easy questions, but then they will get stuck into the methodology, because the methodology will be perceived to be something where you've accounted for what you're doing, you've done your best, it may not be perfect, It will be a development on methodologies that were appropriate 5 years ago. But, you know, 5 years hence, someone will develop your methodology in a new way to create new knowledge. So this is the bit that you really need to explain, to defend. It can be the Achilles heel of a thesis. Often where that researcher who's scared of that terminology that you've talked about and never got to grips with it, has, by the end of the PhD, not really sorted out their methodology. They kind of pretend it doesn't exist. They'll shove it into the literature review, it'll be at the bottom of some page somewhere, and the examiners and the viva will extract it and then talk to you about it at length. This is a typical thing. So all of this terminology, that's difficult terminology, in a way I think you need to get to a stage where you can say to a researcher, tell me what you're doing and how you're doing it. And they'll be able to say, I'm doing a post-structural analysis of advertising documents from the 1970s. And that makes sense to a certain group of... Whereas if they start umming and ahhing and, oh, well, I'm looking at this to try and prove that, but I'm not sure, so maybe we'll look at this. That's not a methodology. That's a series of processes without a kind of label on them. And we need that label, I think.
It doesn't have to be a long... I mean, people say to me, how long should this be? My advice is always go and have a look at other doctorates in your field and have a look at that. Then no more than a page and a half usually, because, you know, as I was told by one of our history students, that they were doing a PhD in history, not a PhD in philosophy.
So we're talking about this section that can be tiny, that can be a couple of pages, that is the hardest to write in terms of thought that goes into it, and then is pretty much the first thing that the examiners go for when you're in the viva.
Yeah, so some of the other things that you might want to write in the section are, you talk about the methodology and the approaches that you use, but also the approaches that you thought of using but didn't use. And that's a really important thing to write about, because it's definitely going to be a question that you're going to be asked in viva.
Definitely.
So, you know, if you've done an autoethnography, which is about stories and your own story, your examiners may ask you, well, why did you do an autoethnography and not an ethnographic study? So autoethnography is ethnographic. An ethnographic study would take in the stories of others. Or why didn't you do a narrative inquiry? Or why didn't you use a different approach? A different approach. They're not limited. So to think about you will have gone through a process of saying, well, I thought about this, but then I didn't go with it. You need to write about that and provide the reasons why, because there would be a justification for why you didn't approach your research in other ways.
Yeah, and I think part of that can look back to the previous section of the literature review, where you've maybe reviewed literature that has used this other methodological strategy, and then you've said why it wouldn't be appropriate for you, or be limiting, or it's just downright wrong, so that when we do what you've talked about, it actually makes a lot of sense to say, I have considered this, but it may not yield the data I need, as is evident in the use of this methodology in this study and that study. So that when the external examiner says, why have you not done this methodological approach, rather than kind of flail around or pull reasons out of the air, you can say, oh, please, can we turn to page 36, look at footnote 2, when I talk about why I've not done this. I mean, to return to my cooking analogy, you're thinking what to make for your Sunday meal. Suggestion of fish finger sandwiches perhaps is made, I don't know. But you think, hang on, it's a Sunday, it's a bit special, my family are coming over, I can't serve them fish finger sandwiches. So you've aired that idea and you've declined it. But we still need that. Because that might be good for our after dinner conversation when they're saying how good the roast was. You can say, I considered fish finger sandwiches, but I decided against that because you'll get those on Monday.
Or fishless fish fingers if you're a vegetarian.
Fishless fish fingers.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so back to the methodology chapter. There's going to be a limitation section in this part of the thesis as well. So and I think our advice here would be, don't tear your work to bits, but be realistic about it. So talk about where a part of doing a doctorate is that you learn things along the way. So it's about what have you learned as a result of doing this, as opposed to I should have done it all differently in the first place.
Absolutely. So some modesty. Because often at the end of the PhD you can have, areas for further consideration.
Yeah.
If someone else is doing a PhD building on your work, the advice could be, I've just looked at this region, what if we shifted it to this region, or what if we looked at different demographics or ran experiments at different ambient room temperatures or whatever. So you're not saying this is the definitive final last word in this research, I will give you the absolute answer. You're saying, let me explain why I'm doing this, what I'm doing, what I hope to find, what are the limitations of this. And the limitations can be quite practical. You've got time and space to interview 100 people, not 800 people. So that can be one particular reason, I think that limitations thing is really important, actually.
So think about the limitations of your work, but don't shoot yourself in the foot. And finally, ethics.
Well, within our regulations, we request that documentation around ethical clearance is included, perhaps in an appendix. And if examiners see that you've interviewed 100 people about teenage pregnancies, they actually need to know that this was cleared, and here's the documentation, here's the evidence that it was cleared. So within the methodology section, I would guess, even if mentioned in passing, this methodology was put to my ethics committee and they cleared it on this date. Footnote, see Appendix 3 for the documentation relating to this sample questionnaire, that kind of thing.
But as an examiner, I would expect it to be discussed in the thesis as well.
Yes,
so I wouldn't be expected to say, ethics were gained, have a look at the ethics paperwork. I would expect a discussion around what the ethical considerations of this piece of research are, and why they're important, why it's important to think about that, and how those concerns were mitigated within the process of the research. How was the research designed in order to ensure that it was ethical?
Which can also go back to positionality, and can also go back to the limitations. There may be groups of people that you can't interview, or there may be archives that you can't get into as well. So, or it may be that the material, the raw data analysis is going to yield problematic information. So I think these things reverberate at other levels of the PhD.
That's true. So, to conclude, top tip for the conclusion. The top tip for the methodology section.
I think you should label it. I think there should be a section called methodology, or research methodology, or my methodology, or something like that, so that examiners are not digging around trying to find it in some other section, but it's actually, even if it's only a couple of pages, it is actually there as the methodology. And that will help you, because you know that you're not going to be writing into other bits of the thesis what you're going to do and why and how you're going to do it. But it can all just be put in this particular section, and then you can develop it, change it, polish it, whatever. So that's my top tip. Label it methodology. And for you?
My top tip for the methodology is to think of structure. So make sure it tells a coherent story about why it was, what are the theoretical underpinnings, what are the philosophical underpinnings of the approaches that you are taking, if philosophy is relevant, or if not, obviously just the theoretical underpinnings. Why you chose the approaches that you chose, why you didn't choose other approaches, how you did that piece of research, and how you ensured that piece of research was done ethically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So thank you for listening to our vlog. As always, if you like our vlogs, do follow us, and you can click the button to say that you want to hear updates from us each time we release a new vlog. We release new vlogs every Friday usually, so look out for further vlogs. And if you've got any ideas about topics and areas you'd like us to cover, please do let us know in the comments below. So I look forward to speaking to you again. Bye.